The office of the executive is really becoming its own ecosystem. Nowadays, it can be comprised of one or more executive assistants, a chief of staff, among possibly others, which gives a nod to the old saying that it truly takes a village to manage a busy executive and his or her organization. I'm Catherine Berardi, and welcome to this week's episode of the Chief of Staff Collective podcast. In this episode, we speak to a CEO and his right hand. Adam Hergenrother, CEO of Adam Hergenrother Companies, and his chief of staff, Hallie Warner, share their journey with us. Hallie began her career with Adam as an executive assistant. She later evolved into his chief of staff and hired her own replacement in the EA position. Their story is a great example of what true partnership looks like, learning and challenging one another, and a story of great loyalty. Their relationship even spawned a book they wrote together with practical advice on how they make it work. Here's our interview with Adam and Hallie, the founder and the Force Multiplier.
I'm Adam Hergenrother. I'm CEO of Adam Hergenrother Company. Our organization consists of 5 different organizations. We have Adam Hergenrother Training, Hergenrother Realty Group, BlackRock Construction, KW Vermont, and our foundation, Hergenrother Foundation. I believe that our mission is to serve the moment that's in front of us by raising it up, by training and teaching people how to live with joy and to also provide the most value to people that are around them.
Hi, I'm Hallie Warner. I am the Chief of Staff at Adam Hergenrother Companies, and I have been in this position for about 5 years, and for about 3.5, 4 years prior to that, I was Adam's executive assistant for some of his companies and for him as well. So a total of 8.5 years working alongside Adam.
So we're going to first start by talking about the founder and the Force Multiplier, this book that was written by the two of you. And for those who haven't read your book, but who are listening in, can you give us a brief Cliff's Notes version of what the book is about?
It is really about defining what those two roles mean for us. It really falls more on the entrepreneur executive as the founder, and the executive assistant or chief of staff is really that force multiplier. It's a lot of really tactical information about how to strengthen the relationship between a founder and a force multiplier, how to build leadership skills for both of those individuals and communication skills in order to lead an organization and grow an organization together.
I'm curious, between the two of you, who decided to write the book? Whose decision was it to write this particular book?
The reason why we actually wrote this book was, if you haven't checked into it, herglife.com is a blog that I write every single week. And last year we had about 40,000 people read it from 139 different countries. And the cool thing about having a blog with an audience is that you can test things out. So the first one, Hallie and I wrote together about an EA relationship. Literally in the first 24 to 48 hours, we had the most views we've ever had on that. And we were like, was it time of day? Was it the title? What was it? Was it time of month? And so we kind of just left it there. And then about 90 days later, we tested it again, and the same thing happened. And then again, about 60 days later, we tested the same thing. We came together and we wrote about the EA relationship. So clearly, after testing this 3 times, there was a much needed space for this conversation, because it's such a powerful relationship that I think that there's people that really want to go into these careers and these opportunities. And I think there's a lot of founders who really need these people in their lives. And nobody's really brought that to the forefront of the conversation in a way that people are looking for. So clearly that was one. So that's why we got together and wrote the book, was because we need to provide a voice, a model, a tool to engage in strategic conversations, to engage in fierce conversations, and really providing a roadmap for what it is that somebody needs in a hire. Because as a founder and as an organizer, as a visionary, and if you're doing all these different things, I hear all the time from CEOs that I don't know who I'm looking for. So one of the things we really want to cover in the book was, who exactly is it that you need? There's chief of staff, there's an EA, there's a PA, there's general assistants. So there's just all of these conversations. You knew all this. I'm sure you guys get these conversations too. And so it just needed a model in a prescriptive way that described this process to people to extract the information and utilize it in their life.
Very good. And The title of the book, The Founder and the Force Multiplier, the subtitle, How Entrepreneurs and Executive Assistants Achieve More Together. I know the focus for this book was largely around executive assistants, but you do define a force multiplier as, Adam, to your point, personal assistant, administrative assistant, operations manager, executive assistant, and chief of staff. So fair to say you believe there's a force multiplication spectrum here.
100%. The thing is founders and CEOs and executives, their job is to lead, right? And we can get into specifically what they do. And so there's also this whole other part of their job that if they don't have somebody that they trust to be able to get that part of their work done, then they're at a deficit in trying to take on the first part of it, which is why they end up doing things in their job that they don't necessarily like, which causes suffering and causes burnout in the job. Hallie does a great job of explaining it better than I do about that. Technically, we're doing the same job, just different parts of it. So we're involved in the same project, but it's just we're taking different parts of it. So instead of somebody running the whole thing, you have a force multiplier that allows two amazing people to be in two separate situations, but advancing the project through with better clarity, with more speed, and more of an impact to the audience that you're bringing it to or the potential client.
Yeah. And Adam, what I think is interesting about this conversation with you is that you're not only an executive, but you're a founder, which we've identified at times be difficult, right? For a founder to give up some of this responsibility to somebody else. I'm curious from your perspective, because I know you mentioned in the book, there was a bit of a revolving door of assistance before you found Hallie. So why was that? How did you get to a place where you began this relationship with Hallie, and why was she different?
Well, I mean, I think in the beginning, I had no idea what I was doing, like a lot of people, and just very entrepreneurial. And I literally would just hire out of pain instead of actually taking the time to learn about the hiring process. Most entrepreneurs or founders are very good at one or two things. And I'm going to speak for myself. I suck at everything else, right? And so the minute I try to go in that suck zone where I'm working in, it's just a disaster and people just don't want me in there. And so I realized this early on, but I didn't know how to hire. So then I spent a lot of time, money, and energy and investment into myself to learn about behavior of people so that I could start figuring out, what is my self-awareness? What is like the half thing that I'm actually good at? And then how do I get everything else off my plate? So I allow other people who want to do that and are much better at it than I am in that part of their world to help multiply our organization. So after a lot of trial and error and pain, when I found Hallie, actually at the time that Hallie and I got together, I didn't really have somebody talented in my world like Hallie. Part of it is that people only know the highest level of talent based on the highest level of talent that they have ever led in an organization. I don't mean it's been around them. I mean that they've personally ever led. Because talent's thrown around so much now, it's ubiquitous. But talent, you can have a 1 talent scale for somebody who is a 10 on somebody else's talent scale. So it's just based on your level of talent, right? Do you have a Tom Brady or do you have a high school player? And so for me, when I got in the room with Hallie and I started seeing what a talented person was capable of, it actually changed the trajectory of our organization, because then we created standards around what separated talented people versus people who were just going through the motions in our organizations. And so that hire alone, which I stumbled into, and thank you for joining me, Hallie, gave us the ability to create new standards around who we brought into our world, which, as we all know, when you create a better group of individuals and more talented individuals, everybody wants to be around that. So then it becomes this virtuous cycle.
That's interesting. Yeah. So she, in a way, is sort of acted as this template for what talent look like. And, I think that speaks often to a role like this that's in close proximity to a leader. People look to you in that position, Hallie, to understand, well, what is it that works with this partnership, how you operate with Adam. I'm curious from even early on, and this is a question for both of you, can you think back to specific moments, memories when you felt that you were building trust and rapport with each other?
I cannot think of a specific moment. For me, it really was more about when he started giving me more responsibility than I thought I was even ready for, and putting me into different situations where I didn't think I was ready, but he trusted me. to take on those conversations, those calls, those meetings that I didn't know I was quite ready for. And the fact that he was okay with the fact that even if I made a mistake, he was still okay with me taking that step and taking that challenge on. In addition to that, bringing me to every training event and then really investing into my personal and professional education and growth. That's really important to me. That made me feel like we were really building that relationship and that trust and that loyalty.
Adam, what was different for you, in those early years? Any memories of we're clicking here?
I don't know if there's a specific memory, but I will say like the highlight reel came into play when I would ask Hallie to do something that when I started to realize I didn't have to worry about or think about or follow up on things that I asked for, that was when I really started trusting Hallie. Not from like a trusting like, hey, like I'm going to tell you a secret, like trusting her with actual real things to get done. One of the biggest complaints that I hear from people, and this goes for any relationship in business, where I have to constantly follow up. And the thing is, what happens is you have to utilize mind space to think about those things, which is preventing a founder or an executive from using that to have more clarity to solve larger problems. So when you can delegate or leverage an opportunity, a task, a role, whatever needs to happen, and you don't have to think about it again, you know it's going to get done and done to a level that is above your expectation, that builds massive trust in somebody. Then you start to notice that like, hey, you know what? They can go into this meeting. They can do that, even if they're not quite ready, because you know they're going to figure it out. People also want that little pressure on them to constantly be growing. You don't want them to have too much slack because they'll fall over and want to leave if there's not enough there. You don't want to push them too hard or you push them out the door. It's that constant little like, you lean into me, I'm going to lean into you type pressure their entire professional life.
Something I really enjoyed about this book is that the onus is on both of you to make this partnership successful. Adam, at one point in the book, you said step one is give up control. And I think that is essential. And Hallie, you said this, a lot of EAs come to you and say, how do you get an executive to give up control? Well, it really has to start with the executive. Can you tell us more about that, Adam?
Yeah. When you started saying this earlier, I was laughing because time to me, like somebody taking my time, just like it probably feels to you, is like somebody like stabbing me. Like it's that was like the metaphor I used to use with people, like to the point where like, I was like, wow, like you take my time away from me. It's like there. So it was a really, really hard transition to go through this. Two things went through my mind. One, I started trusting Hallie a lot more. And number two, I'm actually not that great. I'm just good at modeling. And so I studied people that were really, really successful. And I think wisdom is applying models and systems and tools into your life before you have that visceral feeling or before you're really okay with it. Because once you start living it and practicing it and being in your own, that's your own wisdom that you can then share. So I would study people that have done this and they said, look, one of the first things I need to do is give up control. And I was like, well, I can't do that. And so then I sat down and I said, well, you know what? It's not that I can't, I have to. I have to. This is what other people are doing. I have to trust in that process. But then Hallie did a great thing where she came in and said, hey, look, why don't you block off times in your calendar that are your own times that I cannot schedule anything in. And so it was her ingenuity, if that's, I like to create words sometimes, right? in her own ability to give me that kind of like latitude of saying, okay, and that's stuck with us since, like from 11:30 to 1:30 is a blocked off time every single day that nobody can schedule anything in unless it's my permission. So I know that I can work in bursts from 8:30 to 11:30. We talk about this in the book, right? Then from 1:30 till 4:30, anything goes in there as long as it fits in within the goals or the objectives that we have that week or month.
Yeah, that's a great example of Hallie, working within what was possible for you. And I think that's important. It's not as though she could totally change, how you went about your day, knowing that you needed some time. All right, here's a way we can do that. We can solve both of these things. Hallie, I'm curious, from your perspective, what other examples do you have of sort of pushing up against Adam to, hold him accountable to some of these things?
Oh man, Adam is such an accountable individual that he doesn't really need somebody else to necessarily hold him accountable. Once we put parameters and standards and things like that in place, he just operates off of standards. So I didn't need to really hold him accountable to following that schedule per se. but sometimes I might need to hold him accountable or just remind him of whatever we might be working on at the time is more important than some other project that he might want to get started on. So we do have those conversations from time to time.
She's actually saying that very politely. Really what happens is like, I want to go on and do something else, and she will literally be like, what the hell are you doing? And you need to go focus on this, and we need to be focused on this. So it's not accountability of like, hey, to the calendar. It's accountability of you need to get your vision out there. You need to get your clarity out there, and constantly pushing me, because in my mind, I can see it so clearly, yet nobody else can see it. So she is holding me highly accountable to making sure that I am staying point on the message that needs to be spread to our employees or to our clients or the public.
Was that difficult for you, Adam, to hear early on?
Early on, it's still difficult to hear. I mean, it still pisses me off because, you know, as a founder and somebody who creates an organization and has the latitude to do what they want, you don't like people challenging your thinking. And that's what it is. When somebody steps in and does that, they're literally saying, I don't think your thinking's accurate. If you have too big of an ego, you're going to take that the wrong way. And so while it's still there, I also realize how important it is and how lucky I am to have somebody to be able to challenge me in that way.
That's great. Hallie, something I really liked that you talked about in the book, and I think it came from an analogy of Adam's, but you talk about the 0 to 10 principle. Can you explain that for us?
Yeah, actually, to Adam's point that he was just making about being that visionary, he's got amazing ideas all the time, right? So that's like a 1 or a 2. I would then need to take that idea from like a 2 to a 9 and figure out what he actually wanted to accomplish. So that might be asking questions, gaining clarity so that we could then go execute. That also means doing a lot of research, pricing, putting budgets together, speakers together, whatever the case may be, depending on what project we're working on. And then I bring it to a 9, bring it back to him so he can do his kind of final tweaks and make sure it really hit what his intention was from the beginning. And then that's a 10.
I love that. And I'm curious because now it is Adam, Hallie, and there's a new EA in the mix.
Yes, Amy.
And we have the tripod now, which I love. It started as you, Hallie, being EA to Adam, and now there's 2 of you in support roles. And we'll talk more about that here in a second. But in terms of the 0 to 10 principle, how does that work now with an EA and a chief of staff?
Yeah, it doesn't change on Adam's side. The only difference is that Amy and I will work on it together. So she actually does a lot of that, of the legwork now, doing a lot of the research, making the calls, figuring out all the details. She'll come back and forth with me to make sure we're really hitting the mark on what Adam wants or what the company might be working on at that time. And then we kind of figure it all out. And it's like a 9.5. And then we go give it to Adam.
That's great because I think we're starting to see this more, right? Where an EA transitions into a chief of staff role and then a new EA is brought in. Can you talk a little bit more about that? How was this decision made? You know, Hallie, for you to transition to a chief of staff role, and did you immediately bring in an EA? Just tell us more about that.
Yeah, I think it was about 5 years ago when I really realized I needed some assistance. And the companies were growing and we just were, reorganizing and adding new business divisions. And I could no longer really do all of the work myself. So we did start having that conversation about where I wanted to go in the organization. I did a ton of research about various roles. I really kind of narrowed it down to where I wanted to be, kind of what I was doing and then what I wanted to do in the future. And that landed between a COO and a chief of staff. And I did an insane amount of research and realized that really what I was doing and where I saw myself, 20 years from now was in the chief of staff role. So after I decided that, I was like, okay, then who do we need to hire to fulfill some of these other needs? And we did have a couple of different versions of executive assistants over the next 2 or 3 years. And then we ended up actually just hiring full positions instead, because that didn't work out at the time of where we were in the organization. And then it was about 2 years ago or so when we were like, okay, now we know what this position is. And we know it needs to be an executive assistant. And then it took almost a year, I think, to find Amy and bring her on.
And I'll make a comment on that too, that you may not always see. I also think, Hallie, during that 5-year growth, you needed to grow and be willing to let go a little bit yourself.
Really?
Through that process. Yeah.
It wasn't like a light switch.
It was
100%.
there. Yeah. And so as that evolved and you basically got to a breaking point, you're like, I just can't do this job anymore unless I have help. Yeah. That's when you realized it was like, okay, I'm serious about this. And the minute you became serious and you put your attention to it, you found an amazing candidate.
Yes, absolutely.
I think that's a great point. I do think it's a gradual thing, this transition from EA to chief of staff. Adam, I'm also curious, when Hallie had this discussion with you about, I'd like to move on, was part of you like, oh, dear God, no? We've got a good thing going here. Can I risk it?
Yeah. Well, I'm always going to come from the approach that I'm going to serve any human being to what they want to do, and I'm always going to support people, especially people that I care as much about as I care about Hallie. So if her decision was that she needed to move on from our company, she needed to move on to something else, she wanted to move on to a different position, then I was going to support that. I was definitely not going to get in the way of it. And frankly, I wake up every day to get experiences in life, and every experience is a little bit different. A rattlesnake is different than a butterfly, but they're all about growth. And so I look at this opportunity from a wider perspective of this is an opportunity for me to grow, for me to reset boundaries, what I need to do. And so then when we started talking it through, it made complete sense. And I hear sometimes that people, now you've got there's an investment into that too. Don't forget, and for people, and people are like, well, I don't have the money to have multiple people that are just kind of taking care of you, if you will. But the thing is when you invest into the right people, they provide a better return for you, for your time, for your organization, and for the people that are around you as well too. It's almost like you can't not afford these particular positions, in my opinion. And so we went out there and we basically said, hey, as long as, Hallie, you understand that you're responsible for anything that goes on with this. So if there's an issue that happens, I don't necessarily go to Amy and say, this is wrong. I go to Hallie and I hold Hallie responsible for her. Technically, she's an EA for both of us. Now, she handles me, which is a project, and I don't know how people do it. It's a project, right? But she's also responsible for making sure that, I don't do 411 with Amy. I do 411 with Hallie. She reports to Hallie. So she's actually Hallie's support staff that just happens to be integrated with my life because it just takes off a lot of the reactionary things that she has to do because I'm just constantly changing this and move this appointment, move that. It's a full-time job. And so for years, Hallie was running both of that. She was doing chief of staff stuff and running like a full-time position of just trying to keep up with the daily demands of people trying to get in touch with me, these things or initiatives. And so I woke up and realized that it's your world. Go do it.
I think that's such a great experience for Hallie, right? To take on, and what an opportunity, Hallie, for you to grow into this position. And, what I love about this transition to now 3 of you is, again, it's this mutual thing, right? Things had to adjust on both sides for this to work. And you made it happen. And I like the idea of you still have this close relationship. You go to Hallie, and then now Hallie is learning these people management muscles herself with Amy. All right, if it like Hallie, now you have to give up control. So you're transferring these lessons downward, which I think is really great. Adam, I guess one of the other questions on this topic is some executives, I think, you made the point about these roles being so important to your success and the success of an organization. Sometimes executives have a hard time with having more support staff than others on their team. What do you say to that?
I don't know if I've ever been asked that question. I guess personally, I want to accomplish everything by doing nothing, not necessarily physically. So to me, leverage comes really easily. So I never see that as an opportunity to dismiss. What I would tell people is I would say that if you are functioning at the highest level possible in your role, and multiple people are needed to give you the leverage to keep you sustained in your strength zone, then you need to do whatever you need to do to be in that zone. And if your function is to be a closer, as a baseball player, then you stay as a closer, right? I mean, if your job is to be a pinch hitter, then you stay, and that's the best use of your things, and you stay as a pinch hitter, you surround yourself with a team. So I would just look holistically at the organization and say, where can I stay that serves the greater good? It's not an ego or selfish thing. It's the opportunity to serve the organization, to allow more expansion, more growth, more opportunity for them, because it's keeping you seated in the seat that's going to give the biggest financial impact of the organization.
I love that. Yeah. I can't not talk about this because it was actually my favorite part of the book. it's the user's manuals that you have. When I read this, I thought it was gold. And my first thought was, I want to see a user's manual. And then you actually put examples in the back of the book, which I was just like, oh, yes, this is so good. This to me is so important for partnerships like an EA and a principal, an EA and a chief of staff. And I love that you guys institute these users manuals. Can you tell us more about these? And I'm curious how this came to be.
So we recycled that from someone. I think it was like, I read it like in Inc. magazine or Fast Company, something like that. Like 6 years ago, I think I found it and I brought it to the company and said, we need to implement this. And so we initially just used it with our leadership team in the beginning. And then we only were using it with like new hires. And then now it's really trickled down to every staff member. Everyone completes one when they first join. Every new team member who joins gets the user's manual of their team and their supervisors. And usually we send out Adam's as well so people can understand, him a little bit better. It's a really great tool.
What are you saying, Hallie? You saying I'm hard to understand?
Well, if they could just come ask me too if they have questions. But if people have questions or they're having challenges or tension with another team member, it's also a great tool to pull out, even if it's 2 years into the relationship, and just look at that and say, oh, that's why we're not on the same page. We're not really speaking the same language, or that's why that person did that. That's one of their idiosyncrasies. So it's just a great resource to really understand the individual and their motivation so you can continue to work well together.
For sure. What I loved about it is, in the early days of a relationship, like, chief of staff and executive, a lot of these things you learn through just time together. And I thought, wow, isn't this so interesting to get something like this when you start? Because one, I think there's a level of self-awareness that has to come from putting this together. And that's so important. And then two, it can really spark some interesting conversation. I mean, Adam, one of your idiosyncrasies was like, I will make you uncomfortable, and so knowing that you're going to do that is helpful, right? For somebody the first time where they're like, this is uncomfortable, knowing that that's going to happen, I think could just really help build some of this rapport quicker.
I think that you said it great when you said it brings a self-awareness. If people come into our organization because they want, personal growth through the business success, which is kind of like our kind of ethos, if you will. And so we start right off the gates from that. And so when they sit down to take time to put this together, and we give them examples of ours and other leadership team they're going to be interacting with, they sit down and take time to do this. And it makes them go, okay, let me lose my ego here, because there's no place for that in our organization. So how do we go and let me share some things with you? And it helps out with us in responding. And it may give you that sacred pause for a second before you respond, because you're kind of thinking again, how does this person, is this okay in public, or is this more of a private yelling? Right? So it's, you kind of use that in your own leadership, and it brings the self-awareness right into them.
I'm curious, from completing these for each other, did you notice we have a lot more areas where we don't match, right? We talk about the complementary skill sets often between a chief of staff and a leader, but I'm curious where you feel like the two of you align versus where you feel like you're complementary to each other.
I actually think we align on more than we don't align. I don't know, Adam, if you agree or disagree with that, but I actually think we're really quite in alignment on the majority of things, how we work, that we're really driven by growth, that we have a lot of hunger to succeed, that we really value results, freedom, that sense of urgency. I think we really align on a lot of those things. And then there are a couple of just really key things where we complement each other that makes all the difference.
It was hilarious when Hallie was preparing some of these notes for this interview, and this section over here, she literally had she put all these things where that Adam is wrong and how Hallie compliments it, and there was nothing there where Hallie was wrong and Adam compliments it. So I just
of course not.
It was absolutely hilarious, actually.
Oh my God. Yeah, I can see how that happened.
I think that's such an important thing to remember, is at the end of the day, there has to be alignment on certain things for this partnership to work. Two lefts don't make a right, but too much of the opposite doesn't necessarily work either. And I don't think you get alignment overnight. I think you have to really figure out where those areas are. And what I love about the user's manual is that, again, it can help incite some of this earlier on for these partnerships. And I have to tell you, as part of our process, when we're placing chief of staff candidates with executives, this sounds weird, but we bring in love questions. There's a study that was done that talks about building intimacy between two people, closeness, not romantic, but platonic, any kind of closeness between two people, by asking specific questions that are really more personal.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah, like who's your hero? You know, if you could bring one person back from the dead, who would it be and why? And so what you're trying to understand are what's important to this person at a very fundamental level. And it goes beyond that typical interview of just, tell me what your strengths are and, can you demonstrate these skills, to really start understanding the person. And we find that level of vulnerability is so important in a relationship like this. What I like about that user's manual as well is because it really is more about you as a person and how you best operate. And it can really start to, uncover some of those things about yourselves and about each other.
Yeah, before we even hire any candidate, we do really in-depth behavioral profiles. We do something that's called a life story. So it's definitely important to understand the whole person, especially, as you said, in these roles.
Is there anything you feel like we didn't talk about that you would like to discuss about the book? Hallie, for you, from going from EA to chief of staff?
Nothing specific comes to mind, Adam, unless there was anything you wanted to touch on.
The only thing I would add is that I think people are awakening to this conversation, but I think people also in a founder's role or an executive role needs to first mentally understand the importance of having somebody next to them that can force multiply their life, and really look at it as that type of strategic partnership, which is the words that we continue to use. Because I think there's still this kind of some old grained mentality that having an assistant next to you is about doing rudimentary items instead of looking to hire somebody who is truly like a talented individual who's going to force multiply whatever aspect that you're doing of the job to give you the freedom, to give you the ability, to give you the clarity, to give you the opportunity to also challenge your own thinking. There's not many CEOs or executives or assistants that have people that challenge them like that. And the ones that do are so much better off. So I also think there's a shift in the thinking of an executive or a founder to understand the implications of what can happen to your business and to your own life when you really embrace this concept.
I love that, because I think there is, a lot that leaders still need to understand about this position.
They don't. I mean, look at the chief of staff of the White House. The chief of staff of the White House has more authority than the vice president of the United States does. Right. And we see that as, it's not technical authority, but you understand they actually get more done than the vice president does, right? Because they can't live in the same room. So when they think of it that way, they think, oh, that makes sense, but they don't bring it into the business world. And so that's why I think when we wrote the book, the reason why so many people are interested in this is because they go, well, I'm starting to hear more about this. It's becoming a louder conversation, but yeah, I need something prescriptive to help me understand this. And that's how you understand this is you bring in knowledge to individuals, the importance of the role, and really kind of reshaping of how people view the image of what a chief of staff is in the business world, what an EA is, what a PA is, what an ops person is, right? What an assistant does. And so once people can comprehend that, I think they're going to allow that to be a key position that you bring into your life.
I love it. You said that very, very well. And what I love about the book is that it's with both of you. It's not one perspective or the other. It's the two of you together. And I think that speaks to the strategic partnership that is so helpful in your world and making everything run. So really appreciate that, having both perspectives as you're reading this. And I encourage people to pick it up, because I think it's a great book, whether you're an executive assistant or a chief of staff or anything else in a support role to an executive. There's a lot you can take away from this book. So really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Chief of Staff Collective podcast. You can hear us on your favorite podcast app every other Monday. Make sure you subscribe, rate, and review so you don't miss an episode.